A few days ago, I was scrolling through TikTok, and within maybe 5 minutes, I learned that I might have an anxious attachment style, unresolved childhood trauma, people pleasing tendencies, emotional avoidance, and apparently my nervous system is dysregulated too, which is honestly kind of impressive. I opened the app because I was bored for like 10 minutes and somehow left feeling like I had accidentally received the first chapter of my own psychological evaluation. And the funny thing is, none of those videos sounded ridiculous. They all sounded kind of convincing because every single one of them started with something so painfully ordinary. If you overthink text, if you hate confrontation, if you need a lot of reassurance, if you suddenly lose motivation, and you're sitting there thinking, yeah, I do that. Then another video comes up, and another, and another. At some point, it stops feeling like you're just watching content and starts feeling like you're collecting explanations for yourself. Like every habit, every emotion, every awkward conversation you have ever had is waiting for the correct psychological label. And honestly, I'm not even making fun of it because I've done exactly the same thing. I think almost everyone has. We like explanations, we like patterns, we like believing that your life makes sense if you can't just find the right framework to put them in. But somewhere in the middle of that, scrolling, I caught myself thinking something I'd never really thought about before. When exactly did being a person become something you had to constantly figure out? Because it almost feels like understanding yourself has quietly become another responsibility. You're supposed to know your attachment style, your boundaries, your communication patterns, your childhood wants, your love language, your coping mechanisms. It's almost like there is this invisible expectation that before you can actually live your life, you should first understand the person who is living it. And maybe that's a good thing. Seriously, maybe it is. There are people who finally understand why they have been suffering because psychology gave them words they never had before. Therapy has helped millions of people. The internet has helped millions more realize that what they experienced wasn't normal. I don't want this to turn into one of those videos where everything modern suddenly ruined humanity because I don't actually believe that. But I also can't stop thinking about something. The more I looked at all of this, the less I believed it started with TikTok. Actually, the more history I read, the stranger became because the internet didn't invent the idea that the answers to your life are hidden somewhere inside you. It inherited. Welcome, I'm Angelina. That's where the story gets really interesting because if you go back far enough, people weren't looking inside themselves to find trauma or authenticity or attachment styles. They were looking for something completely different. The strange thing is, if you start looking for the history of self-knowledge, you very quickly run into this phrase that almost feels too perfect for this video. Know thyself. And I mean, we all know this phrase now. It sounds like something you would see on a Pinterest board or in a self-help book or under a very dramatic black and white photo of someone staring out of a window, but originally it was not really that. It was written at the Temple of Apollo at Delphi in ancient Greece, and the funny thing is that when we hear know yourself today, we immediately hear it psychologically, like know your personality, know your wants, know your desires, know what makes you different from everyone else. But for the Greeks, from what I understand, it was much closer to something like know your limits. Know that you're human, know that you're not God, which is such a different meaning because it is not telling you to endlessly look inward until you discover some hidden emotional truth. It is telling you to understand your place in the world, not to become arrogant, to not mistake yourself for something larger than you are. And honestly, I find that difference kind of fascinating because it means one of the most famous phrases about self-knowledge in Western history originally had almost the opposite emotional atmosphere from the one we give it now. Today, know yourself feels expansive, like go deeper, discover more, uncover another layer. But back then, it also had this sense of boundary, limitation, measure. Like do not lose yourself in the fantasy that you're unlimited. And even with Socrates, who is probably the person we most associate with the examined life, the point was not exactly find your attachment style, obviously. The point was more ethical. What is justice? What is courage? What is a good life? What kind of person should I become? So there is self-examination, yes, but it is not self-examination as personality analysis. It is not this modern habit of turning your inner world into an endless psychological map. And then much later, Christianity takes this inward gaze and gives it a completely different intensity. Because now the inside of the person becomes the place where sin lives, and temptation lives, and guilt lives, and salvation is somehow at stake. And Augustine's confessions are so important here because he's not just telling us what happened in his life. He's searching his own soul like it contains evidence. He writes about desire, memory, shame, weakness, the things he wanted and did not understand. And it is not therapy, of course. It is not modern psychology, but it's one of those moments where the inner life becomes a serious historical object. And now that I think about it, maybe this is the first big turn in the story. At first, looking inward was about knowing your limits. Then it became about finding the hidden truth of your soul. And once a culture teaches people that the truth is somewhere inside them, it becomes much easier centuries later to believe that every strange feeling must also have some hidden meaning. At some point in history, people started doing something very dangerous. They started taking themselves seriously. And I don't mean this in a bad way necessarily. I mean, obviously, it is good to think your life matters. Very nice, very inspiring, 10 out of 10 would recommend. But there is also something a little bit funny about it, because once people began to believe that their inner life was not just morally important, but personally unique, then suddenly the self became a project. Like, not just I have a soul and I should probably not destroy it, but I have a personality, I have a special inner truth, I have a life story, I have feelings that are not just random noise, but maybe the deepest part of who I am. And this is where the modern person starts to appear, because if you go back far enough, most people did not really have the luxury of sitting around asking, who am I really? There were already many things before they ever got the chance to ask. They were someone's child, someone's spouse, a farmer, a merchant, a monk, a noble, a servant, a member of a village, a church, a family, a class. And I know it is a little dangerous to generalize, because people in the past were not just NPCs, obviously. They had emotions, they had secrets, they had thoughts, they had trauma. I mean, medieval people were not just standing in fields like background characters waiting for the Renaissance to give them a personality. But still, the question, who am I, did not have the same cultural weight. Then, over time, especially with the Renaissance, with diaries, with autobiographies, with the rise of individual experience, and later with Romanticism, something shifts. Feelings start to become more than feelings. They become evidence of your authenticity. And honestly, that is such a modern idea. The idea that somewhere inside me, there is a real version of myself, and my job is to find it, protect it, express it, and build a life around it. This is where Charles Taylor becomes really useful, because in Sources of the Self, he talks about the history of inwardness, about how modern people came to search for moral meaning inside themselves, and not only in God, tradition, or the outside order of the world. And once you have that idea, life becomes much more free, but also much more exhausting. Because if your identity is given to you by the world, that can be impressive, obviously, but if your identity has to be discovered by you, then suddenly you become responsible for finding the correct version of yourself, which sounds beautiful until you realize that nobody gives you the instructions. So maybe the modern problem is not just that we think about ourselves too much. Maybe it is that we inherited this idea that somewhere inside us, there is a truer self waiting to be found. And once you believe that, it becomes very difficult to stop looking. And then, somewhere around the end of the 19th century, another strange idea enters the story. The idea that maybe you don't actually know yourself. Not completely. I mean, imagine hearing that for the first time. You have spent centuries looking inward because that's where truth supposedly lives, and then someone comes along and says, well, actually, the most important part of you is the part you can't even see. That is such a ridiculous plot twist. And yes, I'm talking about Freud. Now, Freud gets made fun of a lot today, and honestly, sometimes for a good reason. If you've ever taken an introductory psychology class, you know he somehow managed to connect almost everything back to childhood, your parents, or sex, which is ambitious. But I don't think Freud's biggest influence was any particular theory. I think it was something much deeper. He taught people to become suspicious of themselves. Before that, if you felt angry, maybe you were just angry. After Freud, anger might be covered in fear or shame or desire or something buried so deeply that even you don't know it's there. Your own mind suddenly becomes an unreliable narrator, and that changes everything. Because now understanding yourself is no longer about paying attention to what you feel. It's about asking whether what you feel is even the real story. And once that idea enters a culture, it doesn't stay inside psychology textbooks. It spreads. Gradually, people begin talking about themselves differently. They don't just say, I'm unhappy. They ask why. Then they ask why that why exists. And then, well, they ask why in the first place. Which is funny because I think we've done that at least once. You start reflecting on your own thoughts, then you start reflecting on your reflections, and before you know it, you have somehow spent 40 minutes trying to understand why you paused for 3 seconds before replying to a text message. Around the 20th century, this way of thinking starts escaping the therapist's office. Psychology slowly becomes part of everyday life. Sociologists like Philip Rivke noticed this happening. Instead of explaining ourselves through religion, tradition, or duty, we increasingly started explaining ourselves psychologically. Then Eva Illouz makes another observation that I honestly found fascinating. She argues that psychology didn't just become something we study. It became the language we use to describe almost everything. Relationships, work, family, love, conflict, even ourselves. And once you notice it, you can't really unnotice it. We don't just say someone is selfish anymore. They're emotionally unavailable. We don't say someone is difficult. They're avoidant. We don't say we're overwhelmed. We're dysregulated. None of those words are necessarily wrong. Some of them are incredibly useful, but they do something interesting. They encourage us to see ourselves as puzzles waiting to be solved. And maybe that's exactly why the internet felt so natural when it arrived. Because by then, we were already looking for explanations. The internet simply gave us an infinite number of them. So by the time the internet arrives, the ground has already been prepared, which is the part I find the most interesting, honestly, because it is very easy to look at TikTok, Instagram, YouTube, whatever, and say, this is why people overanalyze themselves now. And I understand why. The evidence is not exactly hiding. You open an app for entertainment, and within 30 seconds, someone is explaining why the way you drink coffee means you are avoiding intimacy. And you're like, okay, I just wanted caffeine. But the more I think about it, the less I believe the internet created this obsession with the self. It did something else. It removed the ending. Because for most of history, self-examination had some kind of container. Confession happened at a specific time, in a specific place, with a specific purpose. A diary could be closed. A book could end. Even therapy, ideally, has some kind of direction. You go there, you work through something, you try to understand it, not because the goal is to analyze yourself forever, but because the goal is to live with a little more freedom. But the internet has no natural stopping point. There's always another video, another framework, another label, another reason why you might be the way you are. And because the algorithm learns what holds your attention, it starts giving you more and more of the thing that makes you look at yourself. So if you watch one video about attachment styles, suddenly your whole feed becomes a small psychological comedy meeting about your personality, and all of them have notes. This is where self-awareness starts to feel different, not deeper necessarily, just more constant. You're not sitting quietly with yourself. You're being interpreted by 1,000 strangers who have never met you, but somehow all sound very confident. And again, I don't want to pretend this is useless. Sometimes these videos genuinely help. Sometimes a random person online gives you a word for something you have felt for years. That matters. But there is a difference between finding language and being trapped inside language. Because once everything has a name, everything starts asking to be analyzed. A bad diet becomes attachment theory. A lazy afternoon becomes a dopamine addiction. A disagreement becomes emotional unavailability. A normal human flaw becomes a sign. And at some point, you stop asking what happened. You start asking, what does this reveal about me? Which is such a modern question, almost too modern. Byung-Chul Han writes a lot about how modern people end up exploiting themselves, managing themselves, optimizing themselves from the inside. And I think this is part of that same world. The self becomes something you supervise, not just because you are. And maybe that is why self-awareness can feel so exhausting now. Not because knowing yourself is bad, but because the work never really ends. The internet did not teach us to look inward, and made sure there were always more to find. And this is where I keep coming back to the first moment. Me scrolling through TikTok, trying to relax and somehow living with a suspicious amount of new information about my nervous system, which is funny because nothing about that experience felt historical while it was happening. It just felt like modern life being modern life. But after looking at all of this, I don't think the strange part is that we want to understand ourselves. People have always tried to do that in some form. The strange part is that we now behave as if understanding ourselves is something we are supposed to finish. Like somewhere out there, or maybe somewhere inside us, there is a final explanation, a final label, a final pattern, a final version of the self that will finally make every bad habit, every fear, every relationship, every strange little emotional reaction make perfect sense. And I get the appeal. I really do. Because if you can explain yourself, then maybe you can control yourself. And if you can control yourself, then maybe you can stop disappointing yourself, which sounds very nice. Personally, I would also enjoy becoming a perfectly understandable person. Very convenient, very clean, probably impossible, but aesthetically pleasing. But maybe that is where the trap is, because at some point self-knowledge stops helping you return to life and starts delaying life. You think, I will live more freely once I understand why I'm like this. I will love better once I fix this pattern. I will start creating once I solve this insecurity. I will become myself once I finally discover who that is. And I mean, sometimes that work is necessary. Sometimes you really do need to stop and understand something before you can move. But I don't know, I also think a lot of us are waiting for a level of clarity that no human being was ever built to have. Because if history shows anything, is that the self has never been a simple thing. For the Greeks, it was something to measure. For Christians, something to confess. For modern people, something to discover. For psychology, something to interpret. And for the internet, something to constantly update. So maybe the question is not whether we should know ourselves or not. That feels too simple. Maybe the question is whether self-understanding is supposed to be a doorway or a room, because a doorway is something you pass through. You understand something about yourself and then you return to the world a little differently. But a room is something you can get stuck inside. And I think that is what happens sometimes now. We get stuck inside the interpretation of ourselves. We become so busy reading our own lives that we forget we are also supposed to participate in them. And maybe, honestly, the healthy thing is not to stop thinking about yourself completely. That would be impossible. Also slightly concerned. Maybe it is just to remember that you do not need to become a perfectly explained person before you are allowed to live. You can understand yourself partially, imperfectly, a little awkwardly. You can know some things and still not know others. You can have patterns without turning your whole existence into a case study. And you can probably have one bad day without needing to diagnose the entire architecture of your personality, which personally I find comforting. Because maybe we were never supposed to solve ourselves completely. Maybe we're only supposed to understand ourselves enough to come back to life with a little more honesty. Anyway, that's what I thought when I started asking when being a person became something we had to constantly figure out.